I took my stranded CEO home, and my daughter showed her what family means. Drive away, Bertil. You have a daughter to get home to. Let me freeze. It's what I deserve anyway. The billionaire CEO spat, shivering violently in her ruined designer coat as the blizzard raged. I don't leave people behind, Ms. Lima. Especially not my boss, Bertil yelled over the howling wind. Soledad Lima was the most ruthless woman in the corporate world, known for destroying careers with a flick of her wrist. But stranded in the merciless snow, she was just a broken, terrified woman. Taking her home would change everything. The sky above the towering glass spire of Lima Holdings wasn't just dark, it was a bruised, apocalyptic purple. Bertil McCormick tightened the scarf around his neck, leaning his broad shoulders against the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The winter storm of the decade had descended upon the city with a sudden, vicious fury, turning the bustling metropolitan streets into a frozen wasteland in a matter of hours. The municipal sirens had been wailing since noon, urging everyone to seek shelter. Bertil, a mid-level logistics manager whose days were usually spent untangling supply chain nightmares, was one of the last to leave. He had stayed behind to ensure his team got out before the subway lines shut down completely. Now, as he trudged toward the parking garage, the wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The snow was falling so thick and fast that it felt less like weather and more like an assault. His old rusted 4x4 truck coughed twice before roaring to life, the heater groaning as it pushed tepid air into the cabin. Bertil gripped the steering wheel, his mind entirely fixed on one thing: getting home to his 7-year-old daughter, Margrethe. The babysitter had called an hour ago, panicking about the whiteout conditions. Bertil had promised he was on his way. The drive out of the city centre was a nightmare of abandoned sedans and flashing hazard lights. The radio crackled with static, the emergency broadcaster's voice breaking through intermittently to warn of unploughed roads and sub-zero wind chills. As Bertil navigated the treacherous, winding stretch of the canyon road that served as the quickest route to the suburbs, his headlights caught the faint, silvery glint of metal in the ditch ahead. He slowed his truck, the heavy winter tires crunching against the packed ice. Through the swirling vortex of white, the silhouette of a massive, elongated luxury vehicle emerged. It was a customized Maybach, angled sharply downward, its front bumper buried deep in a snowbank. Bertil cursed under his breath. He couldn't just drive past. He threw his truck into park, grabbed the heavy emergency flashlight from his glove box, and stepped out into the howling maelstrom. The cold bit into his exposed skin like a swarm of wasps. Wading through knee-deep snow, he approached the vehicle. The engine was dead. The windows were heavily tinted, caked with ice, but as he shined his light through the driver's side, he saw it was empty. He moved to the rear passenger door and wiped away a patch of frost with his gloved hand. Inside, curled into a tight, shivering ball on the pristine leather seats, was a woman. Bertil yanked on the door handle. It was locked. He rapped his knuckles hard against the glass. The woman jumped, her face turning toward the light. Even through the distorted, icy glass, Bertil recognized her instantly. It was a face that graced the covers of financial magazines and struck terror into the hearts of board members. Soledad Lima, the CEO and majority shareholder of the company he worked for, the Ice Queen of Lima Holdings. She stared at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and lingering defiance. After a moment of fumbling, she managed to pop the lock. The wind immediately tore the heavy door open, nearly ripping it from its hinges. "Ms. Lima!" Bertil shouted over the roar of the blizzard, shining the light down at her feet. She was wearing a thin, razor-sharp charcoal suit, a ruined cashmere coat, and utterly useless stiletto heels. Her lips were taking on a terrifying shade of blue. Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling so violently her teeth clattered. "Bertil McCormick, ma'am. Logistics, floor 42. Where is your driver?" "He went to find a signal," Soledad stammered, wrapping her arms around her chest. "2 hours ago. He hasn't come back. The engine died. The heater. It stopped." "He's not coming back, Ms. Lima. The roads are entirely impassable up ahead. You're going to freeze to death out here. You need to come with me, right now." Soledad's corporate instincts flared, a pathetic attempt to maintain control in a situation that had entirely stripped her of it. "I cannot abandon my vehicle, McCormick. I have highly sensitive documents. Slawomir Geringer is trying to call an emergency board vote tomorrow morning. If I don't—" "Drive away, Bertil," she suddenly spat, a sudden wave of despair washing over her as a violent gust of wind shook the heavy car. You have a daughter to get home to. Let me freeze, it's what I deserve anyway. I don't leave people behind, Ms. Lima, especially not my boss, Bertil yelled, reaching his large gloved hand into the opulent cabin. Forget the documents. Forget Slauermere. If you stay here, there won't be a CEO for the board to vote on. Soledad looked at his outstretched hand. For a decade, she had relied on no one. She had built walls of ice around her heart, climbing over the ruins of her competitors, trusting only cold, hard data. But looking at the earnest, determined face of the man leaning into the freezing storm, the data was clear. She was out of options. With a shaky breath, she placed her freezing, ungloved hand into his. Bertil practically pulled her out of the Maybach. The moment her stilettos hit the icy road, her ankles gave out. Without a second thought, Bertil scooped the billionaire up into his arms, carrying her through the blinding snow toward the warm, idling engine of his battered truck. The interior of Bertil's truck smelled of stale coffee, pine air freshener, and wet wool. A stark departure from the custom sandalwood scent Soledad was accustomed to in her executive transport. She sat rigidly in the passenger seat, wrapped in a heavy, slightly scratchy plaid blanket Bertil had dragged from the back seat. The heater was blasting at full capacity, but she couldn't stop shivering. "Turn the heat up," she commanded, her voice sounding raspy, lacking its usual commanding boardroom resonance. "It's maxed out, Ms. Lima," Bertil replied, keeping his eyes glued to the barely visible road. He fought the steering wheel as the truck fishtailed over a patch of black ice. "Just keep the blanket tight. We're about 20 minutes from my house. It's not a penthouse, but it's warm. I have a suite at the Waldorf," she muttered, staring blankly at the swirling snow illuminated by their headlights. "Take me there." "The city is locked down. They closed the bridges 20 minutes ago," Bertil stated plainly, turning the wheel to navigate around a fallen tree branch. "My house is in the only direction we can go. You'll have to make do." Soledad fell silent, retreating into her icy shell. She aggressively tapped the screen of her dead smartphone. Nothing. She was entirely cut off from Gerd Decker, her hyper-efficient assistant. And worse, she was blind to whatever maneuvers Slauermere Geringer was pulling in the dark. Slauermere had been waiting for an opening to oust her, and a city-wide blackout with the CEO missing in action was the perfect excuse to rally the wolves on the board. The truck finally lumbered into a modest suburban neighborhood. The houses were small, built closely together and buried under 2 feet of snow. Bertil pulled into a narrow driveway, the truck's headlights illuminating a small, slightly crooked porch. "We're here," he announced, killing the engine. "Step exactly where I step. The ice under the snow is lethal." Soledad hesitated. She looked at the small, peeling front door. It was the antithesis of her world of marble floors and biometric security. But the biting cold in the cabin was returning, forcing her to follow him. Bertil practically had to carry her again up the porch steps, her ruined designer shoes slipping wildly. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Immediately, a wave of glorious, intense heat washed over them, carrying the rich, comforting scent of cinnamon, baking bread, and old wood. Before Soledad could even adjust her eyes to the soft, warm lighting of the hallway, a tiny blur of motion launched itself at Bertil's legs. "Daddy!" Bertil dropped his keys, a massive, genuine smile breaking across his exhausted face as he scooped up the little girl. "Hey there, Squirt. Were you brave for Mrs. Higgins?" "I was very brave. The wind sounded like a monster, but I told it to go away," the girl declared. She was wearing a slightly oversized sweater, mismatched socks, one featuring cartoon dinosaurs, the other bright pink stripes, and she was clutching a well-worn stuffed rabbit missing one ear. This was Magret. Bertil turned to the older woman standing awkwardly in the doorway, who was watching the reunion with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Mrs. Higgins, thank you for staying. I'll double your rate for the hazard." The teenage babysitter, looking intensely relieved, grabbed her coat. "Thanks, Mr. McCormick. My dad's waiting out back in his snowplow." She slipped out the door, leaving the 3 of them alone in the narrow hallway. Magret peeked over her father's shoulder, her bright green eyes locking onto Soledad. She studied the tall, severe woman wrapped in the scratchy plaid blanket. Soledad stood entirely rigid, unsure of what to do with her hands, water dripping from her dark hair onto the hardwood floor. "Daddy, who is the wet lady?" Magret asked, her voice carrying the piercing volume unique to 7-year-olds. "Magret, be polite," Bertil scolded gently, setting her down. "This is Ms. Lima. She's my boss. Her car broke down in the snow, so she's going to stay with us until the storm passes." Magret took a step closer, tilting her head. "Are you a princess?" she asked, her tone dead serious. "You look angry like the evil queen, but you have a pretty face like the princess." Soledad gasped softly, a flush of colour finally returning to her pale cheeks. For the first time in 10 years, someone had spoken to her without a shred of deference or fear. She looked down at the tiny creature. I'm not a princess. I run a multinational logistics conglomerate." Maigret frowned, clearly unimpressed by the title. "Does that mean you're cold?" Without waiting for an answer, the little girl scurried into the adjacent living room and returned dragging a heavy, incredibly fluffy fleece blanket patterned with bright yellow stars. She held it up to Soledad. "You can use my star blanket. It has magic warmth in it." Soledad stared at the offered blanket. In the cutthroat world she inhabited, gifts were always transactions. An offer of help was a veiled attempt to gain leverage. But looking into Maigret's wide, earnest eyes, she saw only pure, unadulterated kindness. Slowly, her trembling hands reached out and took the blanket. "Thank you, Maigret," Soledad whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Okay, let's get you out of those wet clothes, Ms. Lima," Bertil said, hanging up his coat. "I can find you some sweatpants and a sweater. They'll be huge on you, but they're dry." As Soledad followed the logistics manager and his daughter deeper into the small, cluttered, undeniably warm house, she felt a strange, unsettling sensation blooming in her chest. The ice wasn't just melting from her clothes. Something deep within her was beginning to thaw. The lights flickered violently, emitting a low electric hum before plunging the small house into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only sound was the howling wind rattling the window panes. Maigret let out a small yelp of surprise. Instantly, Bertil's calm, reassuring voice filled the space. "It's okay, Maggie Bear. Just the storm showing off. Stay right where you are." Within moments, a beam of light cut through the dark as Bertil clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight. Soledad was standing frozen in the middle of the living room, clad in Bertil's oversized grey sweatpants and a thick, faded college hoodie. She looked less like a fearsome CEO and more like a lost teenager. "Is the power grid entirely compromised?" Soledad asked, her corporate anxiety instantly flaring. "I need to contact Pierluigi Auger on the board. If the grid is down, our automated sorting facilities in the outer boroughs will go offline. We need to enact Protocol Delta." "Ms. Lima," Bertil said softly, moving toward the fireplace. "Right now, the only protocol we need to enact is keeping warm. The sorting facilities have backup generators. We do not." He moved with practiced efficiency. He gathered thick logs from a basket, arranged kindling, and struck a long match. Within minutes, a bright, crackling fire illuminated the living room, casting long, dancing shadows across the cluttered bookshelves, the framed crayon drawings, and the worn, comfortable sofa. He then retrieved a small, propane-powered camping stove from a hall closet, setting it up carefully on the kitchen island. "We do indoor camping when the lights go out," Maigret explained to Soledad, dragging a pile of pillows to the hearth. She patted the spot next to her. "Sit here. The magic blanket works best by the fire." Hesitantly, Soledad sat down on the floor. It was a physical lowering of herself that she hadn't done in decades. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping the star-patterned blanket tightly around her shoulders. She watched Bertil as he moved around the kitchen by the light of a lantern, opening a can of tomato soup and preparing sandwiches. He was so different from the men she dealt with daily. There was no posturing, no veiled aggression, no calculation in his movements. He was simply a father providing for his child, and by extension for her. It was a stark contrast to her own upbringing. She had been raised by her aunt, Ludmila Ostrovsky, a woman whose idea of maternal warmth was buying Soledad a slightly more expensive tutor when she cried. Excellence was the only currency in the Ostrovsky household. Love was considered a bad investment. "Soup's on!" Bertil announced, bringing over 2 steaming mugs of tomato soup and a plate of perfectly browned grilled cheese sandwiches. He set a smaller mug in front of Maigret and handed the larger one to Soledad. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her cold hands around the hot ceramic. The smell alone made her stomach rumble aggressively. She took a sip. It was just canned soup, but at that moment it tasted richer than any Michelin-starred meal she had ever eaten. They ate in a comfortable silence, accompanied only by the pop and hiss of the burning logs. Maigret finished her sandwich and leaned her head heavily against Bertil's arm, her eyes drooping. "Do you have a little girl at your house?" Maigret asked sleepily, looking at Soledad through half-closed eyes. Soledad stiffened. The innocent question felt like a needle to the heart. "No," she answered softly. "I live alone." Don't you have a family? I have a company, Soledad replied, her voice lacking its usual pride. In the warm glow of the firelight, the answer sounded incredibly hollow. That sounds lonely, Maigret mumbled, her eyes finally closing as she drifted off to sleep against her father. Bertil gently adjusted his arm to support his daughter's head, pulling a blanket over her. He looked across the fire at Soledad. The harsh, intimidating lines of her face had softened completely. The flickering light caught a glimmer of moisture in her dark eyes. She doesn't have a filter, Bertil whispered kindly. I'm sorry if she pried. She didn't, Soledad replied, her voice trembling slightly. She looked down at her hands. She's right. It is lonely. I've spent the last 12 years building an empire, McCormick. I crushed competitors. I alienated anyone who tried to get close. I thought power was the ultimate armor. She let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. And yet, a little snow falls, and I'm helpless. I couldn't even start a fire if my life depended on it. Slaumir Geringer is probably sitting in his high-rise right now, using this storm to convince the board I'm an absentee leader, unfit for the crisis. He wants to tear apart everything I've built, piece by piece. Bertil studied her. He saw the immense weight she carried, a burden she never allowed anyone else to shoulder. You're out of your element, Ms. Lima. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. He reached across the small space between them and gently placed a hand over hers. His palm was calloused and warm. The physical contact sent a jolt through Soledad's system. She didn't pull away. Slaumir might know boardrooms, Bertil continued, his voice a low, steady rumble over the wind outside. But he doesn't know loyalty, and he doesn't know you. We'll figure out a way to fight him tomorrow. But tonight, you're not the CEO of Lima Holdings. You're just our guest. You're safe here. Soledad looked from his reassuring eyes down to the sleeping child and then around the small, firelit room. For the first time in her adult life, the crushing weight of her empire lifted just a fraction. As the blizzard raged against the windows, tearing the city apart, Soledad Lima finally felt a sensation she hadn't known she was searching for. She felt home. Sunlight, painfully bright and crystalline, pierced through the gaps in the living room curtains, waking Soledad Lima from the deepest, most unbroken sleep she had experienced in a decade. For a long, disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. She was cocooned in a fleece blanket patterned with bright yellow stars, lying on a worn, overly soft sofa that smelled faintly of wood smoke and vanilla. She blinked, her vision slowly adjusting to the unfamiliar, cluttered surroundings. There were no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. There was no hyper-modern, temperature-controlled smart bedroom. Then, the memories of the blizzard, the frozen Maybach, and the towering man who had carried her through the whiteout rushed back. Bertil McCormick. Soledad sat up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. She was still wearing his oversized grey sweatpants and the faded college hoodie. She looked down at herself, a sharp, bitter laugh escaping her lips. The untouchable ice queen of Lima Holdings, reduced to borrowing loungewear in a suburban house that probably cost less than her annual travel budget. Yet, as she took a deep breath of the cold, crisp air lingering in the house, she realized she didn't feel the crushing, familiar weight of anxiety pressing on her chest. The power was still out. The house was freezing, though the lingering embers in the fireplace offered a faint, localized warmth. "Good morning, sleeping beauty." Soledad jumped. Bertil was standing in the archway of the kitchen, wearing a heavy flannel shirt, his dark hair slightly damp from melted snow. He held 2 steaming travel mugs. The sight of him, broad-shouldered, ruggedly capable, and smiling at her with genuine warmth, sent an unexpected sharp flutter through her stomach. She quickly suppressed it, defaulting to her boardroom posture despite her ridiculous attire. "I am not a beauty, and I am certainly not sleeping," she replied, though her tone lacked its usual serrated edge. "What is the status of the grid?" "Still down across the county," Bertil said, walking over and handing her one of the mugs. "Instant coffee made on the camping stove. It won't win any awards, but it's hot." I managed to dig out the front porch and clear the exhaust pipe on the truck. The snow stopped around 4 a.m., but we're buried under nearly 3 feet of it. The roads are impassable. Soledad wrapped her hands tightly around the mug, letting the heat seep into her chilled skin. "Where is Maigret?" "Still asleep in my room. She's a heavy sleeper. Takes after her mother in that regard," Bertil said, his smile softening into something slightly melancholic. He sat on the stone hearth of the fireplace, stoking the dying embers with an iron poker. Before Soledad could ask about his late wife, a sharp electronic chirp shattered the quiet. Soledad's head snapped toward the sound. It was coming from Bertil's heavy-duty work phone resting on the mantelpiece. "Cell service is bouncing back intermittently," Bertil explained, grabbing the device. "I managed to get a single bar a few minutes ago. I texted your assistant's emergency number from my phone, letting him know you were safe. You reached Gerd?" Soledad scrambled to her feet, abandoning her coffee on the side table. "Let me see it." Bertil handed her the phone. On the cracked screen was a text from Gerd Decker, her hyper-efficient, ruthlessly loyal executive assistant. "Call me immediately. Crisis level red." Her fingers, trembling slightly from the cold, tapped the call button. The line hissed and popped with static before Gerd's frantic voice broke through. "Ms. Lima? Soledad, is that you?" "It's me, Gerd. I'm stranded in the suburbs with a logistics manager, but I am unharmed. What is the situation?" "Thank God," Gerd exhaled, sounding on the verge of a panic attack. "Soledad, it's a bloodbath here. The city is paralyzed, but Slawomir Geringer has already made his move. He's claiming you are missing in action and unaccounted for during a catastrophic crisis. He invoked Article 14 of the corporate bylaws." Soledad's blood turned to ice, colder than the blizzard outside. Article 14, the Emergency Continuity Clause. "He's calling a vote of no confidence. Worse, he's convened an emergency virtual board meeting for noon today. He, Campbell Hruber, and Susanna Nascimento have already drafted a press release stating you are incapacitated. Slawomir is pushing to be named interim CEO, effective immediately. If he gets Pierluigi Auger and Philippe Duhamel on board, he has the majority. They will lock you out of the system before the snowplows even reach you." Soledad gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Slawomir, that treacherous, opportunistic snake. He had been waiting for months for her to show a single moment of weakness. Now he was using a natural disaster to steal her empire. "I won't let him," Soledad hissed, her voice vibrating with lethal intensity. "When the meeting starts, patch me in. I don't care if you have to bounce the signal off a military satellite. I will not be buried by Slawomir Geringer. The cell towers out there are failing, Soledad. If you drop the call during the vote, it will only prove his point that you cannot lead. I'll send you the secure conference link, but you need a stable connection." The line abruptly died, replaced by the hollow beep of a dropped call. Soledad stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her empire, her life's work was slipping through her fingers, and she was trapped in a freezing suburban living room. "Problems?" Bertil asked gently, having heard the rising panic in her voice. Soledad turned to him, her eyes wide and terrified. The Ice Queen facade shattered completely. "I'm losing it, Bertil. I'm losing everything." For the next 2 hours, the small, rustic kitchen transformed into a chaotic war room. Bertil didn't offer empty platitudes or useless apologies. He didn't look at her with the pity she despised. Instead, he slipped instantly into his element, problem-solving. While Soledad paced the worn linoleum floor, her mind racing through corporate bylaws and legal countermeasures, Bertil was ripping apart a closet, emerging with a dusty box of old radio equipment and a spool of thick copper wire. "My dad was a ham radio fanatic," Bertil explained, his large hands working nimbly to splice wires together. "During Hurricane Sandy, he jury-rigged a signal booster that kept the whole block connected to emergency services. If I run this copper line up the chimney to the roof antenna and bridge it to the internal modem, I can hijack the backup emergency municipal bandwidth. It's highly illegal, but it should give your phone a stable, broadband-level connection." Soledad stopped pacing and stared at him. She was used to interacting with Ivy League-educated vice presidents who couldn't figure out how to unjam a printer without calling IT. This mid-level manager from floor 42 was currently engineering a telecommunications felony to save her career. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice soft, devoid of its usual commanding edge. "Slawomir takes over. Nothing changes for you. You still manage your supply chains. If anything, helping me could get you fired if he wins." Bertil paused, wire cutters in hand, and looked up at her. His deep brown eyes were steady, anchoring her in the turbulent storm of her own anxiety. "I told you last night, Miss Lima. I don't leave people behind, and honestly, Slawomir Geringer doesn't know the first thing about our ground operations. Last quarter, he tried to cut the maintenance budget for the trucking fleet by 40% to pad the shareholder dividends. If he runs this company, people like me, the ones actually moving the freight, will pay the price." He went back to stripping a wire. "Besides, I don't like bullies." Soledad felt a strange tightening in her chest. Loyalty. Unconditional, unbought loyalty. It was a completely foreign concept. She pulled out one of the mismatched wooden kitchen chairs and sat down, watching his strong hands work. "I was raised by my aunt," Soledad said quietly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Ludmila Ostrovsky. She was an oligarch of the old regime. When my parents died, she took me in, but she didn't raise a child. She forged a weapon. If I fell and scraped my knee, she wouldn't bandage it. She would lecture me on my lack of situational awareness. She taught me that relying on anyone was a fatal vulnerability. To survive, I had to be colder, smarter, and more ruthless than everyone else." She looked down at her hands, still clad in the oversized sleeves of Bertil's hoodie. "I've spent my entire life building an impenetrable fortress, and yet one storm and the walls are collapsing." Bertil finished wrapping electrical tape around a joint and set the tools down. He walked over and crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Your aunt was wrong, Soledad," he said softly, using her first name for the very first time. The sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold house. A fortress made of ice might look impenetrable, but it's brittle. It shatters under pressure. Real strength isn't about isolating yourself. It's about knowing who you can trust to help you hold the walls up. He reached out, his rough, warm thumb gently wiping away a stray tear that had traitorously escaped the corner of her eye. The intimacy of the gesture was staggering. Soledad leaned into his touch, her breath hitching. For a fleeting, electrified second, the distance between them evaporated. She could smell the pine and coffee on his skin, feel the magnetic pull of his quiet, unshakable strength. "Daddy?" They both pulled back abruptly as Margaret shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. She was dragging her stuffed rabbit by the ear, wearing a thick, puffy winter coat over her pajamas. "It's freezing in my room," the little girl mumbled, her teeth chattering slightly. "I know, sweetie," Bertil said, instantly pivoting from the intense moment back to fatherhood. "Come here." He scooped her up, wrapping his arms around her to share his body heat. Margaret looked over Bertil's shoulder at Soledad. "Are you still sad, princess?" Soledad offered a small, genuinely warm smile, a rare expression that transformed her sharp features into something breathtakingly beautiful. "I am not a princess, Margaret. But no, I'm not sad anymore. Your father is helping me fight a dragon." "My dad is really good at fighting monsters," Margaret said confidently, resting her head on his shoulder. Soledad looked at the two of them. The fierce, protective love radiating from Bertil toward his daughter was palpable. It was a warmth that rivaled the fire in the living room. In that moment, staring at the mid-level manager and his 7-year-old child, Soledad realized a terrifying truth. She didn't just want to save her company anymore. She wanted to protect this. She wanted to be worthy of the man who had waded into a blizzard to save her. "All right," Bertil said, setting Margaret down and pointing to the jerry-rigged router on the table. "The antenna is connected. Plug your phone into this battery bank. Let's go to war." The digital clock on Bertil's phone struck 11:59 a.m. Soledad sat at the kitchen table, her smartphone propped up against a sugar bowl, connected by a tangle of copper wires to Bertil's makeshift signal booster. Bertil stood behind her, a silent, towering pillar of support, his hand resting lightly, reassuringly on the back of her wooden chair. She tapped the secure link Gerd had sent her. The screen flickered, loading the virtual boardroom interface. Because of the limited bandwidth, she kept her camera off, appearing only as an audio icon. Instantly, the sleek corporate voices of the board members filled the small suburban kitchen. "Cannot allow sentimentality to blind us to the facts," Slawomir Geringer was saying, his voice oozing with a practiced, oily concern. "Soledad Lima has been missing for nearly 24 hours in sub-zero conditions. The police cannot locate her vehicle. As tragic as this situation is, Lima Holdings cannot be rudderless during a catastrophic weather event. The outer borough sorting hubs are failing. We are bleeding millions by the hour." "Slawomir is right," Campbell Hruber, the chief financial officer, chimed in, his tone clipped and nervous. "The market's open tomorrow. If the shareholders smell a leadership vacuum, our stock will plummet. We need a steady hand at the wheel." "Suzanne," Slawomir continued, clearly relishing his moment of triumph, "is the press release prepared?" "Yes, Mr. Geringer," Susanna Nascimento, the head of PR, replied smoothly. "We have framed it as an indefinite leave of absence due to unforeseen emergency circumstances, emphasizing your immediate appointment as interim CEO to ensure market stability." Excellent. Pierluigi Philippe, do I have your votes to enact Article 14? There was a heavy pause on the line. Pierluigi Auger, the oldest member of the board and a longtime ally of Soledad's, sighed heavily. I don't like this, Slaumir. It feels rushed. But if Soledad is truly unreachable... Soledad unmuted her microphone. I wouldn't hit send on that press release, Suzanne. You'll find the retraction highly embarrassing. The virtual boardroom plunged into a dead, shocked silence. If Soledad had detonated a bomb in the executive suite, the impact would have been less spectacular. Soledad? Pierluigi gasped, relief flooding his voice. Ms. Lima? Slaumir stammered, the oily confidence instantly evaporating from his tone. We were led to believe you were lost in the storm. We were merely taking necessary precautions to protect the company's interests. Save the platitudes, Slaumir, Soledad snapped. Her voice was pure ice, slicing through the digital connection with lethal precision. But beneath the coldness, there was a new, grounded strength, a resonance she had borrowed from the man standing behind her. You were attempting a hostile coup while the city was buried in snow. It is pathetic, even for you. Now, see here, Soledad, Campbell Huber started. Silence, Campbell, she commanded. Slaumir claims the outer borough hubs are failing. He's lying, or he is simply incompetent. Soledad pulled a piece of lined notebook paper toward her, notes Bertil had frantically jotted down 10 minutes prior. The Queens and Brooklyn sorting facilities are fully operational. They switched to backup generator protocol Delta at 2:00 a.m. Furthermore, our trucking fleet is not paralyzed. The municipal plows are prioritizing major arteries, but our secondary routes through the industrial sectors are clear. We are currently rerouting 70% of our high-priority freight through the old Navy Yard corridors. That's impossible, Slaumir sputtered. VP of Operations told me the yards were snowed in. Your VP of Operations leads from a desk, Soledad countered, her eyes flicking up to meet Bertil's proud gaze. My logistics teams lead from the ground. They are handling the crisis perfectly. There is no emergency, there is no leadership vacuum, and there will be no vote on Article 14. You don't have the authority to unilaterally dismiss a board motion, Slaumir yelled, his composure finally breaking. Philippe, advise her. Philippe Duhamel, the head of legal, cleared his throat. Actually, Ms. Lima, as the motion was seconded by Campbell, the bylaws dictate we must still hold the vote, unless you are physically present in the executive boardroom to veto. A convenient technicality, Felipe, Soledad sneered. But fine, let's vote. Before we do, a new quiet voice entered the call. Soledad froze. It was Renee Luna. Renee was her protégé, a brilliant young executive Soledad had mentored for 5 years, grooming her for the C-suite. Ms. Lima, Renee said, her voice laced with a strange mixture of regret and ambition. While your logistical updates are impressive, the fact remains that you are trapped outside the city. You cannot physically sign the emergency FEMA contracts required by the city governor this afternoon. Slaumir can. Soledad felt the blood drain from her face. Renee, what are you doing? I'm voting for the company, Soledad, Renee replied coldly. You taught me to never let sentimentality cloud a strategic maneuver. Slaumir is in the building. You are not. I second the motion for interim CEO. The betrayal felt like a physical knife twisting in Soledad's gut. Renee, the one person in the building she had actually trusted. Slaumir hadn't just orchestrated a coup. He had turned her own protégé against her. The vote is tied, Pierluigi Auger announced quietly. It comes down to me. Soledad, I'm sorry, but Renee is right about the FEMA contracts. If we don't sign them by 5 p.m, the military will commandeer our logistics hubs to distribute supplies. We will lose control of our own infrastructure. Pierluigi, give me until 4 p.m, Soledad pleaded, desperation finally bleeding into her voice. I will get to the city. I will sign the contracts. The bridges are closed, Soledad. The roads are a graveyard of cars, Slaumir mocked. You're trapped. 4 p.m, Pierluigi, Soledad repeated, ignoring Slaumir. If I am not in the boardroom by 4 o'clock, you can give Slaumir the company. A heavy sigh echoed over the line. 4 p.m, Soledad. Not a minute later. Meeting adjourned. The call disconnected. Soledad stared at the phone, her hands shaking violently. The adrenaline crash left her hollowed out. She had survived the ambush, but the war was lost. There was no physical way to traverse 30 miles of frozen, abandoned wasteland in 4 hours. She buried her face in her hands, a choked, broken sob escaping her throat. It was over. Then she felt Bertil's large, warm hands gently grip her shoulders. "Get your boots on, Ms. Lima," Bertil said, his voice a low, thunderous rumble of determination. "We have a deadline to meet." She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Bertil, it's impossible. Your truck can't make it through the barricades. The plows haven't even reached the highways." Bertil offered a slow, dangerous smile that transformed him from a gentle father into the man who untangled the most impossible logistical nightmares on the eastern seaboard. "Who said anything about driving the truck? I told you I manage supply chains, and I know a guy with a snowcat." The machine was a mechanical beast, painted a blinding, industrial yellow that cut through the monotonous white of the blizzard-ravaged landscape. It was a Prinoth snowcat, typically reserved for grooming black diamond ski slopes, boasting massive triangular treads that could chew through solid ice. The driver, a burly bearded man named Big Jim, who managed a municipal fleet and owed Bertil a life-saving favour from a supply chain crisis 2 years prior, merely tipped his grease-stained cap when Bertil and Soledad climbed into the cramped utilitarian cabin. "JFK to Manhattan in a blizzard, Bertil. You always call when the weather is lovely," Jim grunted, throwing the massive dual levers forward. The snowcat lurched, its diesel engine letting out a deafening, chest-rattling roar. "Just get us to the Lima Holdings Tower by 3:50 p.m., Jim." "I don't care how many snowbanks we have to climb," Bertil shouted over the engine noise, pulling a heavy pair of insulated industrial earmuffs over Soledad's ears to protect her from the din. The journey was a surreal, terrifying odyssey through a post-apocalyptic New York. They crawled over the Long Island Expressway, which had been transformed into an unrecognizable white desert, scattered with the snow-buried lumps of abandoned vehicles. The sheer scale of the disaster was humbling. Soledad sat tightly wedged between the frozen steel door and Bertil's massive shoulder, wearing a borrowed high-visibility parka that drowned her slight frame. Her mind, usually a terrifyingly ordered filing cabinet of strategies and market projections, was entirely chaotic. Every time the snowcat tilted precariously over a massive drift, her stomach plummeted, and her gloved hands instinctively clamped down on Bertil's forearm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he adjusted his stance to absorb the shock of the violent ride, keeping her anchored. She looked up at his strong, unshaven jawline illuminated by the harsh green glow of the cabin's instrument panel. "Who is this man?" she wondered for the 100th time. He was risking his life, calling in massive personal favours, and defying the highest echelons of his own company's executive board, all for a CEO who hadn't even known his name 48 hours ago. "Why, Bertil?" she finally asked, pulling the earmuff away just enough to be heard over a lull in the engine's roar. "You could have stayed by the fire with Magret. You are risking everything. Slaumir will terminate you the second he realizes you aided me." Bertil didn't look at her immediately. His eyes were fixed on the treacherous, icy horizon. Then he turned, his deep brown eyes holding a warmth that rivaled the hearth they had left behind. "Because Lima Holdings isn't just a ticker symbol on the stock exchange to me, Soledad. It's the warehouse workers, the truckers, the administrative assistants who rely on those paychecks to feed their own Magrets. Slaumir doesn't see them. He only sees numbers. You used to only see numbers too. But last night I saw something else. I saw someone worth fighting for." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Someone worth fighting for. Not for her wealth, not for her power, but for her. The Ice Queen fortress inside her chest didn't just crack, it shattered entirely, melting into a rush of overwhelming, terrifying emotion. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes as the heavy treads chewed through the snow. For the first time in her life, Soledad Lima surrendered control, trusting her fate entirely to someone else. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked mercilessly. 3:15 p.m., 3:30 p.m. They breached the city limits at 3:42 p.m., the snowcat navigating the eerie, silent canyons of Manhattan's skyscrapers. The streets were entirely unplowed, a solid sheet of white. As the sleek, towering glass spire of Lima Holdings finally loomed into view, the clock read 3:52 p.m. "This is as far as I can take you," Jim yelled, killing the throttle as the machine idled atop a massive snowbank just a block from the corporate plaza. "The plaza steps are too steep for the treads. It's enough. "Thank you, Jim," Bertil said, shoving the heavy metal door open. The biting wind immediately swirled into the cabin. He jumped down into waist-deep snow, turning back to catch Soledad as she slid out. 8 minutes, Soledad gasped, her breath pluming in the freezing air as her borrowed boots hit the snow. The adrenaline was a tidal wave in her veins. "Then we run," Bertil said. He grabbed her hand, not with the gentle reassurance of the night before, but with the iron grip of a soldier charging into battle. Together they waded, stumbled, and fought their way through the massive snowdrifts choking the corporate plaza, moving toward the grand glass doors of the empire she was about to lose. The executive boardroom on the 60th floor was an oasis of sterile, temperature-controlled tranquility. The mahogany table gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic god's-eye view of the frozen city below. Slawomir Geringer sat at the head of the table, his manicured fingers steepled in a gesture of absolute oily triumph. The digital clock on the wall read 3:57 p.m. To his right sat Renée Luna, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional detachment, though her eyes betrayed a frantic, restless guilt. Campbell Hruber, Suzanne Nascimento, and Philippe Duhamel were arrayed around the table, a tribunal of corporate vultures waiting to feast. Pierluigi Auger sat at the far end, rubbing his temples, looking 10 years older than he had the day before. In the center of the table rested the heavy, leather-bound emergency FEMA contracts, alongside a gold-plated fountain pen. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," Slawomir said, his voice dripping with faux sorrow. "It is 3:58 p.m. It appears our esteemed CEO could not conquer the elements. It is a profound tragedy, but as we agreed, the company must survive." He unsteepled his hands and reached out, his fingers brushing the cool gold of the fountain pen. "Philippe, record in the minutes that at 3:59 p.m. the board officially recognized Soledad Lima's incapacity, and that I, Slawomir Geringer, assume the role of..." The heavy, soundproof double doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were violently shoved apart, crashing against the stops with a sound like a gunshot. The entire board flinched. Gerd Decker, Soledad's assistant, who had been standing anxiously by the door, let out a choked gasp of pure shock. Standing in the threshold was an apparition. Soledad Lima, the immaculate, terrifyingly polished CEO, looked as though she had crawled out of a frozen hellscape. She was wearing a massive, stained, high-visibility industrial parka over oversized, sweat-stained grey loungewear. Her dark hair was tangled and wild, wet with melted snow. Her face was flushed, her lips chapped, but her eyes burned with a dark, lethal fire that made the blood freeze in Slawomir's veins. And she was not alone. Flanking her, standing like a towering, insurmountable mountain of muscle and quiet menace, was Bertil McCormick, his heavy boots leaving puddles of melting snow on the priceless Persian rug. "Step away from my chair, Slawomir," Soledad commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying low-frequency resonance that vibrated in the teeth of everyone in the room. Nobody moved. The shock was too absolute. Soledad marched toward the head of the table. She didn't look like a CEO, she looked like a warlord. She reached the table, snatched the gold pen from Slawomir's trembling fingers, and flipped open the FEMA contracts. The clock ticked over. 3:59 p.m. With vicious, slashing strokes, she signed her name on the dotted lines. She slammed the binder shut and tossed it to Gerd. "Scan those to the governor's office immediately. Tell the military to stand down. Our logistics hubs are secure." "Yes, ma'am," Gerd practically squeaked, clutching the binder like a holy relic and sprinting from the room. Slawomir finally found his voice, sputtering wildly. "Soledad, you look insane. You cannot just storm in here." "Shut your mouth," she hissed, turning on him with predatory grace. "You invoked Article 14 on a lie, Slawomir. You claimed the outer borough hubs were failing, but they weren't. You knew they weren't, because you were the one who ordered the backup generator maintenance deferred last quarter to pad your own departmental budget. You deliberately crippled our infrastructure to orchestrate this crisis." Campbell Hruber, the CFO, went pale. "Soledad, that's a serious accusation. You have no proof of deferred maintenance." "I have the ground reports," Bertil's deep voice boomed, echoing through the silent room. He stepped forward, dropping a thick, snow-dampened manila folder onto the mahogany table. Time-stamped maintenance logs from the Queens and Brooklyn foreman. Slawomir denied the purchase orders for the generator diesel 3 weeks ago. He manufactured the vulnerability. Slawomir's oily confidence vanished, replaced by stark terror as Pierluigi and Philippe stared at him in horror. "This is corporate sabotage, Slawomir," Soledad said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are not just fired. I am having legal draft the paperwork for criminal negligence and fraud. Security will escort you from the building. If you speak a single word to the press, I'll bankrupt you so thoroughly your grandchildren won't be able to afford a hot dog." Slawomir opened his mouth, closed it, and looked around the table for an ally. He found only averted eyes. He stood, his knees visibly shaking, and stumbled out of the boardroom. Campbell Huber quietly followed, knowing he was next. Soledad then turned her piercing gaze to Renee Luna. The young protégé was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, tears welling in her eyes. "Soledad, Renee stammered. "I thought I was doing what you taught me, striking when the iron was hot, being ruthless." Soledad looked at the young woman, seeing a perfect mirror of her former self, cold, isolated, driven only by the mechanics of power. A wave of profound sadness washed over her. "You did exactly what I taught you, Renee," Soledad said quietly. "And that is my greatest failure. I taught you how to be a machine, but machines break when the power goes out. You are demoted to junior analyst. If you want to climb back up, you will start by spending 6 months on the warehouse floor with Bertil's teams. You will learn that this company is made of human beings, not stepping stones." She turned away from the stunned board, her eyes finding Bertil. He was watching her, a small, incredibly proud smile playing on his lips. The war was won. The empire was secure. But as she stood in the center of her reclaimed power, Soledad realized the boardroom felt utterly, devastatingly empty. 3 days later, the blizzard had broken, leaving the city glittering under a brilliant, unapologetic sun. The plows had cleared the major arteries, and the frantic heartbeat of New York City was beginning to thud back to life. Inside Lima Holdings, the shockwaves of the snowcat coup were still vibrating through the glass walls. Slawomir and Campbell were gone. Renee was in a high-vis vest in a Queen's sorting facility, and the board had unanimously rubber-stamped Soledad's immediate restructuring of the executive suite. But the most shocking change wasn't on the organizational chart. It was the CEO herself. Soledad stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office. She was wearing her armor, a razor-sharp midnight blue designer suit. But the terrifying, icy aura that had defined her for a decade was absent. There was a softness around her eyes, a grounded stillness in her posture. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Lima, the new Vice President of Global Logistics is here to see you," Gerd announced, his voice carrying a note of smug satisfaction. "Send him in, Gerd." The heavy oak doors opened and Bertil walked in. He looked entirely out of place in the opulent, intimidating office. He was wearing a new, well-tailored grey suit, but he moved with the same rugged, lumbering grace that he had in his heavy winter gear. "Mr. Vice President," Soledad said, turning from the window. Her heart executed a violent, erratic flutter in her chest, a sensation she was slowly learning to stop suppressing. "Ms. Lima," Bertil replied, stopping a few feet from her desk. He looked around the massive office. "It's a long way up from floor 42. The air is thinner up here." "I know," she murmured, walking slowly toward him. "It's been thin for a very long time, but I'm hoping you can help me change the atmosphere." She stopped right in front of him. Stripped of the adrenaline and the life-or-death stakes of the blizzard, the air between them crackled with a new, intense gravity. She looked up into his deep brown eyes, remembering the smell of wood smoke and vanilla, the crackle of the hearth and the terrifying, beautiful safety of his arms carrying her through the whiteout. "I owe you my company, Bertil. I owe you my life," she said softly. "You don't owe me anything, Soledad. I told you, I don't leave people behind." "You left me behind this morning," she countered, a small, teasing smile playing on her lips. "You didn't answer my text." Bertil chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I was busy moving into my new corner office. Maigret made me a crayon nameplate. It was a high-priority installation." At the mention of his daughter, Soledad's smile softened into something incredibly tender. "How is she? How is the monster fighter?" "She misses her princess. She asked if you were coming back to use the magic blanket." Bertil's voice dropped an octave, losing its playful edge. He stepped closer, the physical distance between them evaporating. I was wondering the same thing. Soledad looked up at him, shedding the final, stubborn layers of the Ice Queen. Ludmila Ostrovsky had taught her that love was a vulnerability, a fatal flaw in the armor. But standing before this man, Soledad knew her aunt had been a fool. The armor hadn't protected her, it had only trapped her. Real power wasn't isolation. Real power was the terrifying, beautiful courage to let someone in. "I don't want to live in a fortress anymore, Bertil," she whispered, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered emotion. "I want to be warm." Bertil didn't say another word. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. He looked into her eyes, asking a silent question, offering a sanctuary she had spent her whole life running from. Soledad answered by rising onto her toes, sliding her arms around his neck, and pulling him down to her. The kiss was like the breaking of a dam. It was a rush of heat and desperate, pent-up longing. It tasted of survival, of second chances, and of a profound, unshakable trust. Bertil wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame, anchoring her completely. For the first time in her life, Soledad Lima surrendered, not to a hostile takeover, but to love. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Soledad rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. She looked out the massive windows at the sprawling city below. It was still her empire. She was still the CEO. But as she held onto the man who had waded into the storm to save her, she knew the truth. The empire was just a building. This warmth, this man, and the little girl waiting for them at home with a star-patterned blanket, this was everything. And so the untouchable Ice Queen found that the strongest fortress isn't built of steel and corporate bylaws, but of the people who refuse to let you freeze in the dark. Soledad Lima kept her empire, but she finally lost her armor, discovering that true wealth is found by the hearth of a family who loves you. If this story of corporate betrayal, frozen survival, and the ultimate melting of a frozen heart kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps the channel immensely. Share this video with someone who loves a dramatic romance with a powerful twist. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another epic emotional drama from us. What did you think of Soledad's revenge on Slawomir? Let me know in the comments below.